Hey everybody, welcome. This is Nico at Locofy. Today I'm going to be showing you how to export Figma designs into production-ready front-end code into a Next.js application using Locofy.ai. So the app that we're going to be building today is this finance dashboard. It's a very pretty design, and I'm going to show you how to use Locofy to configure it on Figma, properly structure the designs, and then we're going to export that to the builder, which is Locofy's environment to create components and high-quality code, and finally pushing it to GitHub, pulling it locally, and then adding Firebase authentication and running the app so it's responsive and it has a basic authentication system. This is the app working on my local machine. It is a fully responsive front-end code, and it also has Google sign-in that when we click it, it's going to authenticate with Google, and it's going to redirect me to the dashboard. Now, this is a fully responsive dashboard, as you can see, and when it reaches a certain size, the navbar wraps, and then when I hover over the navbar, it expands. And when I go almost into mobile, because this was designed for tablet, it is still responsive. So that's the full flow, and hope you enjoyed the video. So let's get started. So before getting started, let's set up the Locofy plugin. Go to Resources, Plugins, and look for Locofy, and run the Locofy free beta. It's going to ask you to sign in. I've already signed in. Go here, and then Create New. We're going to call this Stocks Portfolio. Select the framework Next.js. I chose JavaScript, and you're going to click Create. I already have it created here, so just click the button, and you'll have your Locofy set up with the Stocks Portfolio app. Now, one thing you need to understand about Locofy is that it inherits the responsiveness on Figma, meaning that if things respond correctly on Figma, they're going to respond correctly on Locofy. Now, if I run the preview here, this gives you a live preview of Locofy trying to generate code for us. Now, this is already done. I'm going to show you how to do it all the way. But when we resize this, it's going to respawn on the preview. And if it works on the preview, that means it's ready for export, and it's going to work exactly the same way when you export this code. Now, I'm going to teach you how to do all of this, of course. Same for the dashboard. If we preview the dashboard, now this is the already completed project. So it's not going to work like this at the beginning, and I'm going to show you how to do it step by step again. But this is responding properly on the preview. When we hover over this, it opens up the navbar menu. And pretty much when the preview is ready, again, it's going to be ready for code export, and it's going to work the same when it's in production. So let's get started locifying things. Let's get started structuring these designs properly, and let's get started exporting the highest quality code from Figma. So I'll start with the sign-in. If we go to the sign-in and we try to resize things on Figma, you'll see that it's not responsive on Figma. That means Locofy will inherit this non-responsiveness and it will not work. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make this responsive, and we're going to inherit that into Locofy and expand when we reach the limits of Figma. Now, I want there to be two containers, one containing the sign-in and one containing the image. And when I resize this, I want this to be responsive the same way. And when we reach the limits of Figma, we'll open Locofy to handle that. So let's start by creating a couple of containers. First, the container on the left, we're going to apply some auto layout to this. And we're going to try to make it look exactly like it was. And I'm going to apply some padding on the top. And I'm going to expand this to the sides. And let's center everything. Now, as you can see, because it's centered, it's all going to be, well, in the middle. So I'm going to apply auto layout again. I'm going to align everything to the left. Now this looks pretty similar to what we had originally. And we have a container that contains our signing. Now let's call these good names. So sign in container. Let's call this sign in form. Now our image is a group. And what we basically want is either an image or a frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this as a PNG. And I'm going to do Control-Shift-R to replace it, and keep track of this width, 765. Control-Shift-R, and it replaces the image. And now we're going to do 765. Oh, that's actually not. Let's resize it manually. So this is now a PNG. Let's call this time image, because there's a clock. Now our sign-in has two main containers, the one on the left and the one on the right. Now let's apply auto layout to sign in. And to each of these, let's make them fill the available space horizontally. meaning that when I resize this, they should each take half of the screen. Perfect. Now, the next step is because we've reached the limits of Figma, we want a breakpoint. So when we reach around 900, we want this to become, instead of a row, we want it to become a column. And instead of being fixed, we want to hug it. So it looks like this on web. But we can't do that directly on Figma. So this is where Locofy comes in. So we can actually preview this on Locofy. And as you can see, it works as we expect it to. But now, of course, it's not going to work here because we haven't added any breakpoints. So let's add some breakpoints. So at 960, this still looks fine. And there's one more thing we have to add to this container. So the sign-in container is not filling up the available vertical space, which is what you would normally want on a situation like this. So let's change that. I'm going to go to styling and edit. And on the default layout, I want the height to be 100 view height. Meaning that no matter the size of the screen, it's going to fill up the available space. Now, if you want the image to fill this too, you can also click Fill Container. And when we preview this, if you go down here, it's going to adapt the image to that. The second thing we're going to do is when it reaches the breakpoint, we're going to switch from row to column. So at 960, we're going to make the sign-in container switch from row to a column. And that's not the end of it, because as you can see, we've told the container to fill the available height. So we have to remove that property on 960. And as you can see, it inherited. So instead of height 100 VH, we're going to do height auto. Meaning that when we reach the 960 breakpoint, it'll just wrap downwards. And that's exactly what we want. Now, let's make it so that when we reach another breakpoint, this content in the middle starts filling up the available space, because as you can see here, it is not. Now, in order to make this fill the available space, we have to look at the containers inside. So as you can see, this is hugging. And what we actually want is that when it reaches, let's say 960 to keep it simple, instead of hugging, we want this to fill the container. So let's see how this looks like. So at 960, it is starting to fill the container. Now, of course, there's no padding around it, and it's not centered. Let's tell it to actually do that. So here, as you can see, the content is aligned to the left. So at 960, we want the styling and layout to be in the middle. Perfect. Now, the other thing we want to do is we want these inputs to fill the available space. So a couple of the properties inside of this are fixed, like this input. And what we want at 960 is for them to be filled. So let's fill this up. And let's fill this property as well, this outer container. Let's go to this input that wasn't filled either. Let's fill it up. Let's see this. We go to the sign-in buttons. These are all filling, and these are all filling. Great. So when we reach 960, it is filling the available space. Of course, let's add some padding now to this container. Actually, the outer container, the whole sign-in form container should have some padding on 960. So let's add 30 pixels on the left and right. Okay, and that's starting to look better. As you can see, it's pretty responsive. Now let's fix it for this remember me for 30 days and forgot password, because it seems to not be responding. Let's see why. Oh, that's because the width is fixed. So let's actually fix that here on Figma. Let's actually not fix that there on Figma because it's setting up some default width. Let's fix it on the Locofy plugin. So when it reaches 960, let's do fill container. So when we preview, it is working exactly as we expected. So we got our sign-in form done. Now let's add some interactivity to our inputs. All we got to do is go to the input and tag it as an input with no UI library selected. And now we're going to go to edit styling and layout and set the color to white. So when we type here, it is the color that we want it to. Is that the same thing for the password input? But this time, it's going to be a type password. So let's preview this. Now, it is what we want. I just forgot to set the color to white. Then this is a password. Perfect. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to select this sign in with Google because that's where we're going to be implementing it. We're going to tag it as a button. And then on the actions, we're going to change page to dashboard. And we're going to handle this all on code, but for the moment, we're going to preview this. And when we press sign in with Google, it's going to redirect us to the dashboard. Now let's start making this dashboard responsive. Now, to make the dashboard responsive, there's a couple of things we have to take into account. The first thing is how this will respond as it resizes, right? So this navigation, for example, we can do something like this. And I'm going to show it on Figma so you see what we'll be doing on the Locofy extension. And let me close the Locofy extension so you can see what we're going to be doing. So for these icons, what I want to do is I want to hide the text, and I want to get these to hug. And there's some weird margin here, so let's fix that. So this is what we want. And we also want this to resize here, so it gives more space to this, to the rest of the content. So let's move back and let's actually apply this on Locofy. And beforehand, you saw that weird margin. Probably all of them have this weird right margin. So I'm going to select all of these and give them a right margin of 15 on Figma. And these two probably also have it. Yes, there is. So now it's ready to respond. Now this is also set to hug, and this is also set to hug, so everything should work accordingly. And this is also set to hug. So let's start editing these. So the first thing on Locofy is we are going to go in here, and we're going to make this text on edit styling and layout. When it reaches 1200, we're going to hide this, and we're going to make this container hug the content. And let's do that for the rest of them. Okay, so let's see how it responds when we resize the entire screen. So on the 1200 breakpoint, and let me make this a little bit. So this is what we're getting so far. So let's see what's going on and why this is not getting wrapped. Oh, that is because for whatever reason, our margin on the right is still 81 on this. Let's make it 15. Let's preview once more. And there you have it. Now let's hide that Magio or Maglo on 1200. Let's hide this. And let's make this content to be centered when it reaches the 1200 breakpoint. So let's resize this. And there you go. Our navbar is working. Now let's work on the rest of the content. So let's start by wrapping our dashboard content in a frame. Let's call it dashboard content. And we want to apply auto layout to this. But before doing so, if I apply auto layout now, things will get scrambled because they're not properly contained. And what I mean with that is, let's say these two should be in an auto layout frame. And let's call this dashboard data. This already has auto layout, so nothing to do there. And then let's wrap these two in an auto layout frame so that when we reach a certain breakpoint, we can make them go from a row to a column. Now let's make the dashboard content an auto layout frame as well. And as you see here, we cannot fill the available space. That is because our outermost container doesn't have auto layout applied to it. So let's apply auto layout to it. So now that it has auto layout, we can make all of the children components respond to the horizontal space with the fill property. So I'm going to fill, this header is going to fill, this is going to fill container. And let's see how responsive it is on Figma so far. So we got the header responding, but not these inner contents. So let's make these inner contents respond. I'm going to make this inner one fill. And this one, I want it to be fixed for the time being, at least on the horizontal, at least at this breakpoint. Now let's see why this is not responding. That's because it's aligned to the right. Let's align it to the left. And then this is not filling. And as you can see, I'm making the file structure, I'm making these assets respond to the horizontal space with the fill property. Now this portfolio value has to fill, and this watch list has to fill. So now our content is responding horizontally. Now let's see how Locofy is inheriting these designs. As you can see, the nav bar is working, but there's this weird space here, and this is not wrapping. So let's see what's going on. Now the nav bar, as you can see here, it is fixed. So let's hug it, and let's see if that fixes it. So that fixes it for the nav bar, but the content is still overflowing. So let's fix this part now. Things usually overflow in Locofy when you have fixed elements that kind of push each other. So for example, these text elements are fixed. So let's change them up to hug and hug and hug. All right, so these should wrap correctly now. Now the image, now this is not an image, of course. This is a chart. And Locofy doesn't support charts yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and copy this as a PNG. And then I'm going to remember the width, 763. And I'm going to press Control, Shift, and R to paste and replace. And I'm going to do 768. And I'm going to fill the container with this image. So that this is going to respond now as an image, and we can just leave it as a placeholder and replace it on the code with another chart in library. Now the last thing is down here. Let's check if these elements have fixed elements as well. This is fixed, so let's make it hug. And then let's check this out. So this is fixed, but it doesn't have auto layout. So let's apply auto layout, align it to the left, and hug the contents. Now let's check inside. So this, we cannot hug it because it doesn't have auto layout again. So let's apply auto layout, align things to the left, and it is hugging now. And let's select these elements and hug them. So now let's check it out on the Locofy preview and see if our elements are wrapping correctly. And when I resize this, most things are resizing correctly. Now this image, I know it's looking weird, so let's fix that. A very quick fix for this image not showing up is going to edit styling and layout, and in advanced CSS properties, changing the height to auto. Now the image will resize accordingly with the size of its relative container, as you can see there. Now we're reaching the limits of Figma now, and what we'll want to do is wrap these contents. So let's do that. So wrapping things is pretty simple. We're going to select the container that we want, and we'll make it responsive on Figma first before Locofy. So instead of being a row, it'll be a column. And this is how it's going to look like. And when it resizes, everything should adapt to its relative container, like that. Okay, so I'm going to Control Z. And let's go to Locofy. And let's tell it that this container on styling and layout on 1200, we want the direction to be column instead of row. And the other thing we want is we want this to, on 1200, instead of being fixed width, we want it to fill the container. And let's see how this looks now. So when it reaches 1200, it's going to wrap, and this is filling. And this is exactly what we want. So let's keep resizing. The next thing I'm going to do is these 3 data points, I want them to, at this, let's say 960. At 960, I want them to wrap, instead of a row, into a column, just like we just did with the bigger container. So this, edit styling and layout. On 960, we want the directions to change, like that. Okay, great. So now our dashboard is looking pretty great. Now let's disappear this dashboard and let's get this icons moving to the left. So dashboard, let's say on 960, let's hide it. And now let's make this part of the header. Instead of having a spacing of 45, let's make it auto. It's like a flexbox space between property. And now when we preview this, this works as we expect it to. Now there's one final thing we have to fix, which is we want this navigation on the left to fill out the available vertical space, and we want only the right side to scroll. Now to make our dashboard vertically responsive to the general container, let's click this outermost dashboard container, and let's give it a styling property of height of 100 view height. Now we can also make things responsive on Figma before we translate to Locofy as always. So let's make this container fill. Let's make this container fill as well. Let's make this container fill. Let's check if it's responding as we expect it to. Not yet. That is because in here we have a set spacing between these two containers, these two link content. So let's set this to auto so that when we resize, it's vertically responsive. Now let's see how it looks like on Locofy. Now our navbar is vertically responsive, but our items on the right side are not scrolling yet. So what we have to do is first fill the container, and then on prototype, you have to set the scroll behavior of the dashboard content to be a vertical scroll. So now let's finally preview this dashboard. And as you can see, it's responding exactly as we expect it to. Our navbar is sticky to the left, our content is scrollable, and everything is responsive for, let's say, until a tablet. Because on mobile, it's really hard to see this table. So you'll probably have to work around with this or disappear these items. But for the time being, let's assume this is up until a tablet responsiveness. So now we're ready to export these designs and integrate with login with Firebase. So let's move forward. So now our designs are ready to get exported, but first let's preview the whole thing to make sure everything's working. So our sign in, sign up screen is working as expected. If we press sign in with Google, it opens up the dashboard page. Our dashboard page, when resized, works perfectly fine. Okay, awesome. So these designs are ready to get exported. In order to export, all you got to do is select these two and sync to the code builder. Click View Code in Builder. It's going to sync the assets. When it's done syncing, we can click View Code in Builder. It's going to load the Locofy.ai builder. Now in here, you can do a bunch of stuff, but mainly this is designed for you to preview and export your designs into whatever you want. Meaning you can export these designs into GitHub, you can deploy it into Vercel, and a series of other things like Netlify, GitHub Pages, etc. I'm going to show you how to create components, and I'm going to show you how to export this to GitHub. And finally, when we have the GitHub code on our local machine, I'm going to integrate it with Firebase, and I'm going to show you how to do a simple login with basic navigation using this. So let's get started with the builder. So on the builder, you can see a preview of your entire app and see if it's ready for exporting. So I'm going to say this is approved and ready to go because it's working as I expected to, as well as on the sign-in page. You can also click View Prototype and see this at a larger scale. And you can navigate as well, just like you would on a full app. I'm going to go back to Edit in Builder, and I'm going to start setting up a couple of components because Locofy has already generated code for our designs. Now, this code, all code, is responsive, just like it is on the Locofy preview on the Figma designs. And it's going to show you a layer structure that you can modify and apply components to. So let's get started creating some components. In order to create components, it's actually pretty simple. Look at our code here. This is not the most organized code ever. What we can do is we can click the sign-in container. We have two main things here. We have the sign-in container and the image. So for the sign-in container, we can select the sign-in container. You see it selected it here in blue. And I can click here, make component. It's actually found 2 components that it's going to recommend us to create. We're going to dismiss this for the time being, but we're going to create the sign-in container component by clicking create. And now if you take a look at the code, you can see that a new file was created called sign-in container. And we have the index file. If I press sign in, you can see that our sign-in page has the sign-in container and the image, which is pretty much how I would structure things when I'm developing things. And it automatically imported the sign-in container. And the sign-in container file contains everything that was, well, on the sign-in container before. But now we've modularized it, so the code is more readable. Now let's go to our dashboard and start creating some components there too. Now it's a little bit more obvious here that we will have to create a bunch of components for this to look well structured on the code. Otherwise, we're going to get a huge file. Here we have about 274 lines of code. So let's destructure this. Now, it's pretty obvious how you have to structure this. Here, frame 411 is our navbar. Let's call this navbar. Of course, sidebar is like a child of this. Now let's go to the dashboard content, and we can also click the components that you want to turn into components. So top bar, let's call this top bar. You see Locofy is automatically suggesting you the names for the components you can create. Let's call this dashboard content. Oh, we already have a dashboard content there, so let's call this dashboard data. Let's call this data cards. And this will be data card. I'm going to make components, and it's also going to suggest us, if we've already created a component that has the same structure, we can also choose existing. So data card for this, and I'm going to pick data card for this as well. Let's keep going with the component design. So this is an image. We're going to call this portfolio value chart. And call this watch list. We can call this wallet schedule. That's fine. And let's take a quick look at how the code is being generated. Now, look at that. We have the nav bar, and then we have the top bar and the dashboard data. And we can navigate to each of the files. For example, let's go to the data cards. So you can see data cards, there's a bunch of data cards, and it's automatically imported the components for the data cards. This is, if you're a developer, you know this is fantastic because this helps you export very high quality code that is very readable on a component basis. So that is the power of Locofy. Now let's sync and export these designs to a GitHub repo and integrate Firebase so that you can see a full workflow all the way from Figma to code and adding some backend to it. Now before exporting, there's one more thing I want to show you on the builder, which is auto components. Now Locofy automatically recognizes if there's something that could be a component. And here you can see auto components with Locofy.ai. We can click this one. And here it's suggesting us to create a sign-in form component, which I'm going to accept. Now, we already have a bunch of components that it'll show us here. And look how, if I click on each of them, it's showing me where I created the component and the respective item on the actual design, both on sign-in and on the dashboard, which is pretty great. You can also edit these components right here and change the names and save them. Now, in order to sync these designs, I'm going to push these to GitHub. So I'm going to sync, export, and deploy here. As you can see with the options, you can sync individual components. I have this, for example, portfolio value selected. So it's asking me to sync the portfolio value chart. And we're going to do that later. We're also going to sync components later. But for the time being, let's sync the project. Let's create a new repo called stocks dashboard. It's called portfolio. I'm going to confirm the repo and branch. It's going to ask me to review the file structure and the changes compared to the remote. There's no files to show, of course, because this is a new repo. And I'm going to push to GitHub. It's going to prepare all my files and push them to my GitHub repository on the remote. When it's ready, I have to go to repo. I'm going to clone this repo to my local repo. Open up a terminal, go to my projects, do a git clone this repo. Then I'm going to go in. I'm going to do yarn to install dependencies. Now that all my dependencies are installed, I'm going to code, open up in Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to run this on my computer. Now here you have the app working. As you can see, the inputs are working perfectly fine. Our password is also being added as a password. And when I click sign in with Google, it redirects us to the dashboard. Now the dashboard is responsive, like we set it up on Figma, and it's looking pretty great. Now let's move on and set up Firebase so we can set up an authentication with Google system. Now what we got to do is go to firebase.com, create a new project. Let's call it Stocks Dashboard Portfolio to keep it consistent. Let's accept these analytics terms, set up the account. Let's just wait for that to finish. And once it's done, it's going to ask us to continue. And it's going to take us to the dashboard of Firebase, where we have to go to project settings and set up the web project. You can see this down here. And it's going to ask us to set up a couple of things, like the name. And let's just click register. It's going to give us some instructions after this about how to set up Firebase, like installing the dependency and the configuration file. And we're going to do that anyways in a second. Just click next, go through it. Like there you have Firebase login to deploy the app. And let's just complete this step. Now it's going to give us a configuration file that we can copy and paste into our project. Now, before moving forward, let's set up the authentication with Google. Let's go to the authentication. Let's get started. And then let's select authentication, the provider as Google. Let's assign ourselves. Let's click save. And now Google is set up to work with our Firebase configuration. Now let's go back to our app and create a Firebase.js file where we'll paste our configuration from the Firebase settings. You go to project settings, scroll down, and you'll get the Firebase configuration there. And let's paste that into our code. I'm going to remove some of the things that we don't need, like this analytics. And then I'm going to move forward to setting up the authentication. Now, before setting up the authentication, I'm going to open a new terminal, and I'm going to do yarn add Firebase. You can also do npm install Firebase. And when that's done, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to import Firebase Auth, and then we're going to import 3 methods from Firebase Auth, which is the get auth, the Google Auth provider, and the sign in with pop-up. Then we're going to create this Google provider that initializes the Google Auth provider instance. Then we're going to initialize the get auth instance, and we're going to call it auth. And then we're going to create this method called sign in with Google, where we are going to return the sign in with pop-up, and we're going to pass the auth method from Firebase and the Google Auth provider initialized. So now that we're exporting the sign in with Google method, we're going to use it on our sign in with Google button. And that's going to be in the sign in form component. And for that, we're going to import our sign in with Google method. And on our button click, we're not going to push unless we've successfully signed in. So we're going to use the sign in with Google method, and then we're going to handle the response. And then finally, when the response is successful, we're going to put this router.push to dashboard on the then statement. That way, when we successfully sign in with Google and authenticate correctly, is going to redirect us to the dashboard. Now, of course, this is not the best practice. Of course, you want a full authentication system, but this is just to show you how you can quickly integrate this with Firebase and redirect from your login and sign in to your dashboard. So I'm going to go to my app and I'm going to click sign in with Google. And as you can see, the pop-up came up and it redirected to my dashboard. Now, it automatically redirected because I've already signed in before, so Google is recognizing that there's a user. Otherwise, you would have just gotten the usual Google authentication flow where you select your account and you log in. Now, here's our dashboard, and we can resize this, and everything is working as expected. So now let's take this to the next level. Now, let's say we want to update these designs all the way from Figma, because imagine that there's a scenario where we actually want this navbar to show the items when we hover over it. Like we can see home, we can see settings, we can see all the text that's inside of it when we're hovering over it. Like when we open it up here. So it doesn't only depend on the breakpoint, but it also responds to our mouse hovering over it. So let's switch over to our Figma designs and start the process. So the question is, what do we want? And in this case, what I want is that when we're at the 1200 breakpoint, which is when the navbar gets hugged, when I hover with my mouse, I want these child elements to show up again. So let's get started doing that. Now, before getting started, I've noticed some of the layer names are not the best. So it's fine here, but for example, in transactions, this transactions text is called dashboard. So let's call it transactions. This invoices is called invoices, that's great. This wallets is called dashboard, so let's call it wallets. And on bar, it's called, on settings, sorry, let's call it settings. Perfect. So what's the behavior that we want? We want that when we hover over this navbar, and let's actually call this navbar. It's called frame 411. Let's properly call it navbar. Now, when we hover over these and they're closed, we actually want them to be open. So let's start with Maglo, and I'm going to select the outer container, and I'm going to resize this so it disappears. And let's show this first text when we hover over the outer container. The way we do this is we select the outer container, and we go to the breakpoint where we want the hover to happen. We're going to select hover. I'm going to scroll down, and down here where it says child layers, I'm going to click show all layers, and I'm going to try to find this Maglo text. So I'm going to click edit, and on hover, we are going to show it. So that means that when we hover over this, this is visible again. So now let's do the same thing for the rest of the navbar elements, like transactions, settings, and others. So let's show all the layers, and I believe they're down here. So here, dashboard, and let's show it. And then let's also add a width of 100 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Maybe 120. Okay, that looks much better. And let's do the same with the rest. So dashboard, transactions, let's show it. 200 width. Invoices, show it. 120 width, my bad. And let me correct this one on transactions. Let's go for wallets. Show 20. And settings. Show 20. And the last two, we forgot to rename them. Let's find them. It's this help. Call this help. And log out. Now let's find it in the child elements of this container. When we hover. And there it is. Log out. Show. And 120 width. And finally, help. Let's show. And 120 width. So now let's see how this looks like when we hover over it. And that is exactly what we want. Finally, let's sync our updated dashboard frame with the builder. And I'm just going to sync that one frame. Now that was pretty fast, so I can view the code in builder. And now let's take a look at our updated dashboard. And let's resize this to make sure this is working. Same as before, but now we have this hover state. Awesome. So our prototype is working just as we expected to. Now it is time to push to GitHub. So just sync project. Let's pick existing, stocks, dashboard portfolio, existing branch, and let's just pick our main branch. Now, as you can see, it's detecting only the changes, and we can push to GitHub. Now that our push is ready, we can handle this locally. So I'm going to go over my code and open up a new terminal. And now we have some changes that we added from Firebase, like the sign in with Google and the Firebase.js. So let's add those changes locally. I'm going to call this Firebase Google login added. And what we can do now is we can do a git pull. Let's check our website. And let's sign in with Google. That's still working. It takes us here. And now let's apply some responsiveness to it so it hides the nav. And when we hover, there you go. So that's how you complete a full flow from Figma to a Next.js live app with some Firebase and backend included, as well as an update made all the way from Figma to code again. So hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and let us know if you have any questions on our Slack channel. And as always, happy coding.